All right. I'd like to welcome everyone to episode number 17 of the Rooster's Crow podcast. Today, I am very blessed and gracious to have Rafe Kelley with me here. Rafe, welcome to the podcast.
James, it's a pleasure. It's nice to meet you.
Yes, likewise, likewise. And a lot of these conversations I've been having have just, I don't have any plans. Things pop up, it looks like on the little tiny corner of the internet that we both explore.
Yeah.
I'll see a conversation. A lot of times recently, it's been happening with Paul Vanderklay, and I spoke with Vin Armani, and maybe I haven't heard of him at all prior to seeing him on Paul's channel, and I talked with him like 3 days later, and had a great
Nice.
conversation, and we're still connected. And the same thing kind of happened with you, and I don't always get the impulse, and it's not really clear why. Like when I see someone, because I watch Paul's rando conversations and a lot of his conversations, I don't really always get the impulse to, hey, I want to reach out to that person. But it
Yeah.
happened with you. Like I was listening to, and I was in the parking lot at Publix, which is like a grocery store here. I'm like, let me reach out. And then, here you are. So thank you. I appreciate your time. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I enjoy it. When I get a chance to tune in, Paul's a great conversationalist.
Yeah. Yeah. He's wonderful. And I guess I want to get into your background. But just, I guess, generally, what do you think is going on with conversations like what Paul's doing, what Jonathan's doing? What's going on there? Is it just an outgrowth of the intellectual dark web with more spiritual roots, or what do you think's happening with these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've started defaulting to talking about this little corner of the web as the sense-making community. I think maybe that's a rebel wisdom term, but I guess I like it better than the intellectual dark web. So it seems to me that there's a variety of communities that are intersecting, that are interested in how to have it. Maybe you might say that it's about how to have a generative conversation, right? How to have a conversation that's about generating insight and maybe even wisdom. And I think that was a big part of what spurred the growth of, what you might call the intellectual dark web. But there were, the game B conversation had kind of been happening in the background behind that already. That was another area. And the integral conversation, was ongoing. And so all these little communities are sort of fighting each other, I think. And one of those was the, I don't know, for me, it feels sort of like a very different iteration of Christianity, almost. It's like a Christianity that's, I really don't know. I don't have high confidence in my ability to speak about this, but I suppose the way I perceive it, and this really very much in relationship to Peterson and Vanderklay and Peugeot, is that a lot of the Christianity that was at the forefront of the culture war in the 90s and the aughts was a very reactive sort of Christianity that that was threatened by science and modernism.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe it was not integrated, right? It was not integrating these things. And then what I see with Paul, with Jordan, with Jonathan, it's not reactive to science really at all. It's moved past that point. They're not looking to debate the reality of evolutionary biology. That's not it. It's not, they're trying to point to something else about the nature of religion and why it might be something we should engage with or understand. And I started following both of them out of all the people that kind of came out of commenting on Peterson, and then they both sort of also started commenting or being engaged with John Vervaeke when he came out, and obviously that's a common interest that I share. But the reason that I was following them is because their perspective was the most difficult for me to understand, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was simply that there's this large pool of people who are religious, and they operate in a very different worldview than mine. And so there's more of a challenge to try and understand the perspective. And that's why I ended up sort of following their work in particular, of all of the people who got engaged in this conversation.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. I think I share your kind of fascination with this phenomenon that's happening, because it seems like these are earnest people that are not trying to talk you into something or give you apologetics in some sense, but
Mhm.
really believe what they're saying.
Yeah,
And I find it more fruitful and generative to engage with people like that. And I'm open to not be, I'm open to being changed, right? I'm open to metanoia, right? To
yeah.
change a heart that happens. And that's kind of what draws me there as well. So yeah, I appreciate that perspective. Um, so were you growing up, were you religious growing up? And what was that like?
I grew up in the counterculture. So my family were, so my father's family were, his mother was Polish, very strong Catholic upbringing. And there was a lot of trauma around that because she had an abusive husband and had to leave him. And then she married a man who was actually Mormon, but he was
Mhm.
non-practicing. And so her father, who's basically the biggest sort of baron of industry in our little local area, uh, he's incredibly powerful, influential man, Stan Janik. He referred to my dad and his siblings as the bastards, right? And so they were kind of shunned to some degree because of that. So there's some trauma in that. And then on my mom's side of the family, I think they were just mainly Protestants who were just not very, weren't very deeply practicing. And so both of them moved into the counterculture. And I would say, both of them are spiritual but not religious. And, you know, so I remember when I was little, my parents reading me passages from the Bhagavad Gita, right? And my name is kind of, so the names that my 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 siblings and I got are kind of an interesting window into the culture, right? So my older brother's name is Kai Razus, right? So Ra and Zeus.
Mhm.
Um, and then my little sister's name was Venus Kumara, right? She dropped the Venus, she got rid of that.
Mhm.
But she's named after two goddesses, right? Kumara is a child goddess from India. And then my full name is actually Michael Raphael Seythru.
Mhm.
Um, so Michael's obviously an archangel, Raphael's an archangel. And then Seythru is a New Age Church of Christ Ascended Master.
Mhm.
So the New Age Church of Christ, I think, descends from Theosophy and
Mhm.
all the kind of weird stuff that was happening there. So my dad was exploring that around the time that I was born. But I never, like, my parents were exploring the stuff, but they didn't really impose it on us, right? There was no practice involved. There was no, we went to hippie gatherings and we kind of got to pick and choose what we participated with. So I didn't have any really strong religious tradition that I was engaged with until I was maybe 9 years old, when I had a mentor who was a big part of my life. And he started taking me to something called the Red Cedar Circle, which was a revival of Native American religious traditions,
Mhm.
specifically Salish people from the Pacific Northwest. So it was taught by a man named Johnny Moses. And so I was involved in that between 9 and 13 years of age. And I ended up being unimpressed.
Mhm.
I felt like there was a lot that was there was a lot of traumatized Christians who were playing out their dramas in a new space, and a lot of guilty white people who were trying to LARP as Native Americans in a way
Mhm.
that wasn't very evolved looking to me, I guess. So that was that was my religious experience, such as was growing up. And then basically in my teens, I became, a militant atheist, and essentially for my 20s, I was kind of along the same lines as Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens, that type of thing, and making all those arguments in online forums, having
Hmm.
all the debates that were au courant at that moment between the the creationists and the intelligent design people versus the evolution biologists and the atheists. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's my
Yeah.
background, such as it is.
Yeah, it's funny. Almost the vast majority of people that I talk to have that same vein that happened in their 20s. And I was,
Yeah.
flirting with, Hitchens and Dawkins and the Four Horsemen, and I remember just burning through Hitchens' videos because they're so entertaining. Where he would
Mhm.
debate, and he would say, "I'm not going to believe in a God that where I'm born sick and ordered well." And I'm
Yeah.
like, I remember hearing that. I'm like, I'd always like they make arguments and it was fun to watch, but they seem to be gone now, like almost completely. Are there still areas where that debate is still happening? Or do I just not?
Probably. I mean, well, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, right? Right.
Yeah.
Like they had that four debates or whatever. And I mean, I think Sam Harris is kind of the last of the four horsemen who's still really fighting for that specific vision of new atheism. Um, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend an essay called "The Godlessness That Failed" by uh, Slate Star Codex, Scott Alexander.
Mhm.
And he basically makes an argument that if you look at the evolution of internet culture, that a lot of the major figures who are fighting the kind of new atheism war, um, and the forums and kind of areas on the internet that were devoted to that, all essentially, with a few exceptions, all essentially moved into the woke camp around, basically I think around 2013 was essentially when it started happening. So PZ Myers is a really major character to look at in that. Right? He's
Mhm.
not not on the scale of recognition of the Four Horsemen, but sort of uh, you know triple A new atheist, if that makes sense.
It's funny. I was going to, I couldn't remember his name. I'm like, there was this, he was like a biologist, right?
Yeah,
PZ Myers. I couldn't think of his
yeah,
name. I was going to bring him up too, but you just brought him up and
yeah,
brought his name out. So yeah, he was really, active on the chats and the forums, but he
yeah.
wasn't kind of in the popular consciousness as much as those other
Mm-hmm.
four. Yeah. It's called the godless list that failed.
Godlessness that failed.
Godlessness. Okay. Godlessness
Yeah.
that failed. Yeah. Check that out. Um, and it's interesting the qualities that the woke have taken really emerged, I think, in that time and 2011, 12, 13. And it seems like the energy that was the energy that was swelling up with the Occupy movement, right? Where you
Mm-hmm.
had groups of people that were leveraging their energy against the system, the systemic inequality bore out by Wall Street and the kind of crony capitalism, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, that went away. Wokeness and identity politics came to the fore, right? And it's like the powers that be, or even if it wasn't done intentionally, have channeled what I would say is mostly righteous energy in terms of the systemic issues that we have, and have channeled it instead of looking at the system and the structures of the system, reorienting itself to the population to start looking at each other and start fighting each other. And they've done a brilliant job of it. And it's kind of crazy how it came out of nowhere, and how so many well-meaning good people that I know, that I've known for many, many years, just were completely captured by it.
Yeah.
Uh, it's kind of it's strange. What do you think is not that's an easy question. What's happening with that movement, you think?
So I don't think it came out of nowhere. Like I think there's this idea that wokeness just sort of suddenly springs up. Yeah. And I think 2014 is when Jonathan Haidt sort of marks its beginning.
Hmm.
Um, but I didn't complete my degree in anthropology in the early aughts because I felt like it was being taken over by the antecedents of what's happening now, right? And there was, the idea of political correctness, the term political correctness was coined, I think, in the late 80s, and it became a thing through the early 90s. Or maybe it was even back in the 70s. I did some research on this recently, but I'm having trouble calling it up. But basically, by the early 90s, it had sort of died. But there was an initial wave of political correctness that was pushed by people on the left, and that then became parodied. And I think it's deeply related to what's happening now. There's a book that I really recommend called Professing Feminism by, I think it's Daphne Kortke and something Patel. Okay, I remember Kortke and Patel. And they basically track how French postmodernism and critical theory came to dominate women's studies, gender studies departments in universities, starting in the late 1960s, going into the 1970s. And then this produced an environment that was cult-like, and essentially they describe it as, in that book, this book came out in the late 90s, I think, and they describe in that book that, that there came to a point where becoming a feminist was a religious conversion. And it was like watching people who converted to Christianity, except for that Christianity has a redemptive narrative, and that this was just like, it's the bad news instead of the good news, right? Instead of, okay, Christ came and he died, and all of the mistakes that you make and all these terrible things are going to be redeemed, and he went down and defeated death so that you may have everlasting life, right? Like that's a redemptive story. Like, you have to accept that you're a flawed human being, and that you make errors, and that some aspects of yourself are bad. But I think most of us actually, if we think about it, know that, right? So I think that rings true in a way for people. And so then you say, okay, well, there was someone who loved us so much that he was willing to die for us, like that. That's a type of narrative that has a redemptive arc. But the arc that is being essentially propagated through these gender studies, according to that, gender studies departments, according to them, is essentially that there is this overarching patriarchal structure that impacts every moment of every relationship and every aspect of their identity, that oppresses them and holds them down and prevents them from expressing their full potential. That is essentially gone on for the entire history of civilization, and that will continue to go on, basically, right? And you can fight it, but there's something about the way that it's structured where the idea of actually defeating it isn't there, because if it was actually defeatable, it's like you can't just keep going with the fight. So maybe I'm loading more into their description of it than they had, but that was the basic observation. So there was this sort of sense of a dark enlightenment, which you now hear on the right. That was part of this, and that it became, that kind of Kafka trap, right? Where if you don't believe their statements, that's proof that that you're part of the system that they're critiquing. So there's no opportunity for dialogue, and there's this continual contest for piety, where people are constantly stabbing each other in the back and pushing. People call it virtue signaling. I don't like that term. I like the term piety contest better. There's this piety contest that happens, and it becomes more and more like ideological purity. And they describe how this happened in the gender studies departments. And so my model of this stuff is essentially that critical theory and French postmodernism sort of colonized basically starting in gender studies departments and then moving into anthropology and sociology, and then into psych departments and education departments, and that this has been going on since the 1970s, right? So I think there's a lot of this stuff has been propagated, And I think that there's another book that I think is really valuable called The Secret of Our Success by Joseph Henry. And what he talks about there is how um, social systems evolve, right? Human beings are really not that smart when you take them outside of the context of what we, um, of our cultural tools, right? And so you can kind of imagine that there are ideological memes and they're competing in like a Darwinian space. And the way that they get people to organize, the way that they get people to be able to communicate across them, that is adaptive to some ecology that exists at a specific time. Right? So I think sometimes when you see a pattern like that that's been going on for a long time, the tendency is to want to find some cabal of evil people who are propagating it. But I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think that you can look at Gramsci and other people and say, Antonio Gramsci, that like someone laid out the blueprint for this, but there's probably lots of blueprints that were laid out that weren't followed.
Mm-hmm.
And this caught for a specific group of people within a specific framework for a reason, right? Like I think that the wokeness explodes because it's got this history behind it, but it's accelerated massively by the rise of social media.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think you can literally track it, because I think that basically a lot of the more extreme, if you look back at, a lot of these conversations were happening in like new atheist circles, right? And those new atheist circles became Atheism Plus, which was atheism plus social justice. And those conversations were happening on LiveJournal, and they were happening on Tumblr. And like all the craziest stuff that you hear now was all being pushed on Tumblr in like 2011, 2012, right? And then it makes its way over to Twitter and Facebook, and then it's basically having this huge influence on everybody who's coming up through universities, right? Where it's already kind of the ideological antecedents behind it are already really, they're primed. But then you have this system that spreads it and makes it cool and makes it part of creating an in-group for young people that didn't exist before, right? So anyways, I don't know. I haven't studied this in great depth, right? I think I'm probably more aware of it than most people because of my background, and I've been concerned about it since 2000 basically. But it's quite the history project to actually go back and track how this came up, and I think that that the causal mechanisms of history are always really hard to actually get a really firm grasp on. So I don't know. Hopefully that. I don't know if you have any response or a follow-up question on that. I think I don't want to.
No, it resonates. And I think that, I've done kind of, general research recently, just looking into kind of the roots of these ideas. And when I was going to school, I was in philosophy, studying a lot of the Frankfurt School, the critical theory, when it initially kind of was generated there with Theodore Horkheimer, Adorno.
Yeah.
And it resonated with me because, I think to point out that there is corruption in institutions at every level is correct, right? There have been corruptions within the church, within our government, within corporate structures. There is this kind of root of corruption, and I think it's the role of the left. I agree with Peterson here to point out when and in the hierarchy where corruption has taken hold, right?
Yeah.
And I think this ethos of critique has, again, recently been amplified by social media kind of tremendously. But I think the process that kind of took a weird turn, and I think it has to do with kind of post World War II geopolitics, when you had, the time of Herbert Marcuse and was writing, I think, Repressive Tolerance.
Yeah.
Right? while he was in jail, I think in Italy. And then he got a job in academia in the United States, where they started looking at what happened after World War II and the process of denazification, which was implemented quite brilliantly in Germany. All of the all of the media structures, TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, all of them were completely reappropriated by this denazification propaganda program. And it had a really it was a really effective in terms of the outcomes of denazification
Yeah.
and creating kind of this Western liberal democracy in Germany. Um, I think that was there was a strain of that that took this idea of what the Nazis were doing, right, in terms of white power, right, in terms of the Aryan kind of threads that were being weaved and leveraged against Jewish people or against people in that area, and I think that was weaved into this idea, and it eventually bore fruits as what the critical theorists call whiteness now, right?
Yeah.
They call it whiteness, and it's you try to argue with someone, it's like, what is that? What does that mean exactly? And if you dig in, and if you have a discussion long enough, it goes back to this pointing out of this corruptive force, that has, been prevalent throughout our history, but you're giving it a title of whiteness, and it seems like there is a corrupting force, and I think a conversation needs to be had, and I think you know religion and Christianity, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And I think we can take things that at least I considered as superstitious or something for an archaic people to consider, like evil or Satan, right? It's hard to even talk about these words because of their baggage and their cultural baggage, but there is this thread of this disintegrating thread that is inherent within the individual and the collective that raises its head up in very precarious ways in different times throughout history. And I wonder if you subscribe to this idea, which I find I resonate with a lot, that you can't get rid of religion. That if you try to get rid of religion, it resurfaces in the most kind of monstrous ways. And that was kind of what happened in the 20th century, in Russia and in Germany and kind of throughout the world, and is still happening. And the woke movement is a sense of religion with ritual, with kneeling and icons, and this complete capture of ideology that is hard to even point out to someone or even discuss with someone that you care about. You might have a relationship for years. That ideology trumps that long relationship many times, which is strange. So this idea in Ten Commandments, right, is don't have any God above me, right? Which you can think of that, and I've talked about it before. It's like, oh, is it a jealous God? He doesn't want you to worship anyone else over him. Why would a God want him to do that? But it's like, if you invest your desire in anything under than the infinite mystery, which is essentially unknowable, outside of, if you're a Christian, him becoming made man, that will eventually lead to death and disintegration, right? Ideologies become idols, and then we worship them whether we know we're worshiping them or not. So I guess the question inside of there is, do you subscribe to this idea that you can't get rid of religion, and if you try to, we see these
I,
monsters popping up?
I would say yes, but I think it'd be useful to dig into what does religion actually mean,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I think that our models of that could be more sophisticated. Um, I like the idea, Carl Jung said once, that everyone has a God, atheists just don't know what their God is. Right? And I find that seems to be what I experience, right? It resonates with my experience that I remember having a discussion with a vegan, right? He told me that he was a vegan for, sustainability purposes, right? And so I broke down like how much land you can't grow crops on, and that, a mixed farming system is going to deliver more calories from more acreage while, preserving more wildland. Right? And then he was like, I'm a health vegan. And I'm like, okay, well, here's why, you need B vitamins and blah, blah, blah. And then he's like, okay, I'm an ethical vegan. I just don't believe in harming animals. And I was like, well, you've changed the goalposts 3 times now, right?
Hmm.
Oh, this is just your religion, right? It's just an article of faith. Like, there's no point in me discussing this with you
Hmm.
at this point. And so then I just started looking around and saying, like, okay, this person is actually a religious CrossFitter. Like, it's literally their religion. They worship at the altar of CrossFit. I can't
Hmm.
discuss anything, right? Um, and social justice is a religion, and QAnon is a religion. Um, like, you see this happening over and over again. So I think that that's true, and I think that so this is something that again I'd like to dig deeper into and understand better. But I'm moderately familiar with the model of religion that's come out of cognitive anthropology, particularly out of the work of Pascal Boyer. They they hypothesize that humans have something called overactive agency detection. You're walking through the woods and you hear something that might be a bear. Making the error that it is a bear when it isn't a bear is far less costly to you than making the error that it isn't a bear when it is a bear, right?
Hmm.
So the type two error is much more costly. So you're set up cognitively to think that something might be an agent, right? More often than it is. And so if you look at hunter-forager cultures, they have a sense that the entire world is animated by spirits, right? That everything, that the wind is an agent like them, that everything has consciousness and that has an intention and is trying to achieve something. And what's interesting is that if you strip away religion, people tend to revert towards some sort of animist, right? It's amazing to me how many people who are non-believers are huge fans of astrology, for instance.
Hmm.
Astrology is a symbolism, is a symbolic system that has nothing to do with science, that is completely divorced, right? And it's an ancient religious system, right? So you take away Christianity, and all of a sudden people are scoff at someone who would believe in the story of the resurrection, but consult their horoscope every day. So maybe human beings just aren't that good at being scientific thinkers. So I have this theory, and I don't know if this is something that is anticipated in the work of the cognitive anthropologist, or this is my own little take on it. But the basic idea is that overactive agency detection, if it is indeed overactive agency detection, it tends to be a strong stabilizer of cultural technologies. So I think monogamy is actually a really important cultural innovation. And I think really, we're in a culture right now that really doesn't recognize what it's like when you don't have a strong monogamy. Witness the controversy around enforced monogamy. But the reality is that if you look at hunter-forager cultures again, what you see is that you have serial monogamy. So most people at most times are in a relationship with one other partner, but they tend to break up, right, and have short-term marriages. A small number of men at the top of society will be polygynous with a few wives at a time, and men who are higher in status will divorce more frequently and marry younger women, right?
Hmm.
So if you're high prestige and you're in your 40s, you'll still have a wife who's in her 20s, right? And so you just cycle your wives, basically.
Hmm.
And people talk about hunter-forager cultures as being idyllic, and there's some things that are really wonderful about them. There's a lot that we could learn from them. But there's also some really negative realities associated with that. One is high rates of infanticide, lots of spousal abuse, lots of murder. And so monogamy is a social institution that essentially takes this inherent capacity that we have for pair bonding and tries to enforce it socially, tries to create a structure to stabilize it over a longer period of time, because that turns out to be really valuable for children. Children get better care and are much safer in a system in which men are highly incentivized to be dads, right? When when essentially like men have this ability to divert their resources for reproductive fitness into either investing in one woman's children or investing in new mating opportunities with other women. So a system that incentivizes men to invest in a single woman's children, a man to invest in a single woman's children, will get more paternal effort towards each child. Whereas when you have a system that doesn't do that, you have men competing across all of them. So anyways, that's the argument for monogamy. Well, what might be the case is that if you tell people that God wants you to be monogamous, that tends to have more of an impact. And if you have a story, right? If you have a symbolic structure that inherently sort of works well with human psychology, that's going to work better than having a system that just sort of waves at monogamy and says, hey, you should do this. And I think that we can, one of the interesting things that's happened with, the sexual liberation in the West is that the people who are most successful in our society have tended to stay quite monogamous. And the groups of people that are struggling in our society have tended to have a complete collapse of the monogamous system. And it's quite funny now because we have this idea, that monogamy is part of white supremacy culture. Where in fact, it's probably one of the social technologies that is best to help any group of people actually become successful within a modern social context. So to go back for a second, this is a model that I've been playing with for a while, but Nietzsche says, God is dead, right? And then it's going to take us 1,000 years to wash the blood away. And the idea is the entire cultural structure has been disrupted by the death of God, right? Like everything, all of our assumptions about how people should behave were actually at some point rooted back to this assumption about what the divine was. And when you destabilize that, everything breaks. And I actually think that this is related to, that you can map this to concepts that come out of evolutionary biology. So genetically, you have discrete inheritance. You have a series of genes that code for different things in the body, right? And you can end up with, different, you can end up with blue eyes with two brown-eyed parents because of this discreteness, right? You don't just blend the characteristics of your parents. But what people don't understand is that when you select for a region, genes don't perfectly segregate in everything. They get moved around in blocks, basically. And so when you select for a block of the genome, you actually move a bunch of things that are related to whatever characteristics you want. To give you a pretty famous example, people of East Asian descent have a gene called the EDAR gene. So the effects of the EDAR gene include things like prototypical Asian hair form, right? Very coarse, thick, straight hair, smaller breasts with firmer tissue, fewer apocrine sweat glands, which are the sweat glands that give our body strong body odor, dry earwax. And I believe also there's something about the skin that has changed. Now, we don't know which, if any of those, are actually the target of selection. And in fact, Razib Khan, who's one of my friends, speculates that none of those things are what was selected for. That probably has something to do with the immune system adapting to the specific environment they were in. We know, for instance, that coronaviruses, which are very relevant right now, are particularly prevalent in East Asia, and that East Asians have selection on genes that make them more resilient to coronaviruses. So it's quite possible that all of these physical changes, which create a prototypically Asian appearance, were selected for reasons that have nothing to do with appearance and have everything to do with immunity. So that's how you have these pleiotropic effects. but that's just one gene. But then you can also say that if that gene is selected for, genes near it will be selected for some period of time until it's segregated. So if you all of a sudden made that gene very unhealthy to have, very unfit, then a whole structure around it is going to be destabilized. And this is actually how I think cultural things happen as well. So if you destabilize the idea of the Christian God, you destabilize every aspect of your culture that is tied to that or that is dependent upon that, right? Everything that was dependent on that is now in jeopardy. Man, I've gone on quite a tangent here. I apologize. Because the question here was, are we religious? But my point here is that the point that I was trying to get to, and I got a little lost here, is that I actually think that what we mean by religion is actually quite different things in quite different cultures, but that to stabilize cultural technologies, we often rely on the sense of the divine or the sacred as a central node that then can help transmit other things about society that we want to keep going forward. But what that node is connected to isn't necessarily the same in Christianity as it is in Islam, as it is in Buddhism, as it is in Taoism, Confucianism, and Shintoism, and any other religion, right? So when we say religion is inevitable, when you say that within a Protestant Christian context, you are mapping something that's not necessarily the same as you would be if you're saying that in an Islamic context, which is the caution that I had about saying, well, yes. So I think that it's useful to be able to think about what a religion is. Partly a religion is a set of practices that maybe help cultivate wisdom and virtue, and partly it's a set of dogmas that make life simple so we don't have to think about things, or that allow tools of control for people in power to keep people in line and behaving in a specific way that's maybe not necessarily beneficial for them, but is beneficial for the people in power. So anyways, that I think I need to let you respond at that point, because that was quite a lot that I tried to throw in there.
Yeah, that was great. I follow Bert Weinstein a lot, and I appreciate his work. And I've read some of Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, but there's something about that perspective that seems to fall into sort of fundamentalism. I call it like a evolutionary biological fundamentalism, where it's the state and intention, probably not the right word, of the genes propagating themselves into the future. And that seems to be the kind of fundamental idea or heuristic in terms of evolutionary biology. But it seems like that, and this is where, Jonathan Peugeot's work on symbolism, right? The term symbolism comes from the Greek symvoli, which means to be thrown together or to come together. And I think a good way to understand that is think about its inverse is diabolical, right? Diabolical, which is also, obviously connotations to the devil. I think it's in Italian. So diabolical means to tear apart, right? Yes. So symbolic is to bring together, diabolic is to tear apart. And just listening to Brett Weinstein, he's talking about the genes as if they have intention like that. The fundamental reason for the selective pressures and the process of selection in evolution are just to propagate the species into the future, and that's it.
Well, it's not. I mean, from the gene's eye perspective that Dawkins talks about, it's not even to propagate the species. It's literally the gene itself.
The genes, yeah. The
gene itself wants to propagate itself. There's a the idea is there's replicators, right? And the replicators want to. They're essentially, like my Y chrome lineages R1b, right? So R1b has been around for a really long time. Okay. So from my perspective, R1b is basically immortal. I mean, it's like 6,000 years old, but whatever, that's still way older than I am, okay, or will ever be. So that gene is essentially just operating in this milieu and utilizing me as a vessel to move towards the future. That's the idea of the gene's eye point of view. Um,
What's in the future, though? For what reason? I think this is where it gets, the teleological argument. So the gene wants to propagate. The genes want to propagate into the future for just to keep growing, like for the sake of growth, or the future for the sake of the
well,
future. It's.
well, the selective argument is just that genes that don't want to propagate themselves in the future don't,
Mm-hmm.
right? So selection essentially, um, selection just creates, is just, it's a sieve that produces things that want to propagate themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have some sort of chemical process. It's not conscious, it's not agentic, right? At least that's the perspective of evolutionary biology, and we operate within that. And it's very effective, right? Uh, the scientific materialist perspective, at minimum, we can say that it works well enough that you and I can have this conversation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we couldn't have it without it. Or you're relying on that technology. Uh, so, you know, as you mentioned before we kind of got started, right? Like we can talk about this balance between where that perspective might break down.
Mm-hmm.
And I can think about things in more of a say pragmatist thinking, or maybe even more of a phenomenological approach. But when I think about science, I think about science from a scientific lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we think about genes and how they replicate from that lens. We make a set of simplifying assumptions. The assumptions around it is that this model of replicators, it works. But I think I sometimes you're attached to a theory or an approach just because you have to have a ground,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have to have a ground for your thinking. You have to have some set of a priori assumptions. And then if you use a set of a priori assumptions and those assumptions pragmatically work, they allow you to do what you're trying to do, then you're not going to want to put those in jeopardy, right? Or you can't function and put them in jeopardy all the time. And so like you're always going to run into, like, if you question somebody's basic assumptions at a certain point, you're going to run into the point at which it's like, well, those are just the assumptions. That's the axioms that you have to operate within if you want to have the conversation that I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and at that point, it is from a certain perspective that might come across as dogmatic. So I think part of what you're describing is that. But I also think that there's this problem, which is the problem that Peterson talks about in Absolute Meaning, which is that we know these systems work. We know evolutionary biology gives us insights that help us understand the world in a really profound way. We know that, that the empirical method and the experimental method allow us to do things, and that we can't really operate that without assumptions about materialism.
Mm-hmm.
So they work. And then we have this whole set of things that maybe they don't actually work for, but we don't have a replacement system that has the same clear window to truth, right? Like if I'm an engineer, I can say if I do X, Y, and Z on this rocket, it will achieve this trajectory, and I
Mm-hmm.
can do that down to an extraordinarily fine level of precision, right? But I can't, there's no axiomatic system that allows me to derive the optimal way to set up a marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I can talk about the science of, or the science of what different mating systems look like in different areas and how those prop up, but ultimately you're still stuck with problems of value, right? Like, do
Mm-hmm.
you value your individual potential for pleasure more than the stabilization of society and the raising of children, right? Um, you just said, what is the future? It's like, well, if you don't have a concept of the future, then why would you delay the gratification of pleasure now?
Hmm. Yeah. And what it seems like why like we have these wonderful innovative technologies that come from evolutionary biology, and you don't have to efface those to orient them in kind of a higher level type of integration or thinking, right? It's like because at the base level, you have the genes which are propagating, right? Would that necessarily make the human consciousness epiphenomenal and everything that happens on top of the genes, right, as a result of the genes, right? It's a wonderful functional tool that we've identified. DNA. It's another wonderful, just mind blowing innovation and discovery. And when we talk about the information found in the DNA, what is it, like the DNA is a strand, right? It's a beautiful, wonderful mechanism that functions and develops and allows for the propagation of life to occur on the planet. But again, these they're but they lead to more innovations and higher levels of organization, more sophisticated levels of organization that have eventually led to the idea, like you were saying, of the divine, right? And we can
Mhm.
say that there are a lot of dissimilarities about different religions across cultures, but there are a lot of similarities that are kind of quite profound, in disparate times and places in history, right? You have and this idea of the logos, which is very interesting. It sprouts seeds or it pops up in different areas. The Hindus, the Buddhists, the Native Americans, the Nordic people, the Hebrews, right, all have this general idea of this truth process that takes this form of ritual and worship and fasting and whatnot. So there's enough similarities within these different disparate systems that would seem to make you want to look at them as inherently driving an inherently driving force as well, right? So it's like there is this bottom materialist process that's happening that is absolutely necessary and interesting and should be considered and looked at, but it should be integrated and incorporated as kind of there is this spiritual sense, and that's a tough word. You can use it like more. There are more subtle processes that act as more kind of act like attractors, right? Things that are evolutionary. Evolution is not just a bottom up function. There is a top down that
Yeah, this is that
keep.
conversation that I've heard Vervaeke and Peugeot have on and JP Marceau about emanation versus emergence, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and that perhaps you could boil the claim down to um, looking at the sort of the atomistic structure and bringing it up all the way through from physics to chemistry to biology, et cetera. It has given us a certain set of tools that are very powerful, and it explains a lot about our reality, but maybe it doesn't explain everything about our reality. And maybe if we take on this concept of something that comes from the top down, that emanates down from some force above, then that will give us a more coherent worldview. Um, that argument, from my perspective, of something that emanates down is not justifiable within a rational materialist framework.
Mhm.
It may be justifiable within some other framework, and I'm not quite sure. Like it's funny because an hour from now, as we're having this conversation, is going to debut a conversation between Paul Vanderklay, myself, and John Vervaeke.
Mm.
And in that conversation, I find myself, I felt in some sense more aligned with uh, the mission to recover Christianity into the modern world, right? So you could say to that conversation. So I've described myself as a non-theistic Christian, right? And but I would say I think of I'm a non-theistic Christian, which is not quite the same thing as saying I'm certain or I believe, right? It's more of an exploration of what I'm playing with, right? And um, and so there's this. So John wanted to know, like, well, why a Christian? Why a non-theistic Christian? Why not like a non-theistic pluralist, which I suppose is what he is, right? He's someone who has a lot of Buddhism, a lot of Taoism, a lot of Neoplatonism within his worldview, and quite a lot of Christianity, right? But there's not one of those narratives that is foremost for him. And Paul and Jonathan, are basically, it seems to me, quite open to a lot of the pluralism and understanding all of these things, but feel like it's necessary to have one narrative that sort of orients everything, drives everything, and believe that the Christian story is the correct narrative, right? On some deep level. And I kind of end up in between, saying, I don't know that people within the West can go anywhere else other than Christianity effectively. And that I'm not sure that a pluralist perspective can stabilize us, right? I lean more towards the idea that I lean more on the idea of narrative power or I'm more convinced on the idea of narrative as central to how we do these problems than John is. So that's the conversation. And essentially he comes to this idea of, as we move forward into solving the next set of problems and dealing with where we are now, is this a revolution like the Axel revolution, where something needs to emerge that's completely new, like a new psychotechnology or religion that is not a religion? Or is it rather a process of being able to go back to the bones of Christianity, recover it, and integrate it effectively with the insights of all these other systems? And that's the debate that we're having. So in some sense, I'd be perfectly happy in John's system, right? That works perfectly well for me. But I'm more skeptical of it in some ways than the argument that it's Christianity. So I bring that up only because I find it funny, because now in this conversation, I find myself on the other side, where I'm just saying, like, okay, I'm not convinced, right? I'm not convinced that the logical structure that you're relying on, or your epistemology, can really solidify this claim. And this is like, I'm very interested in what Jonathan Pageau has to say, and I think there's a lot of insight in it. But when he talks about these patterns as if they are realities, the same way that physics is real, right? I don't understand the epistemology.
Yeah.
And so my relationship with the scientific method is that I know that it works, and I know that it doesn't solve every problem, right? And we have Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? That tells us that within any set of axioms, we can't justify those axioms. So there's always stuff that's outside of any model that we produce. So I'm open to the idea that there are other models and other ways and other sort of epistemological structures that we can use that will actually be robust and will help us solve these problems. But I'm not sure that we've gotten better than phenomenology is like a way of looking at the world through a narrative, and you just have to choose your narrative, which is okay, but it's not like, okay, that's grounded, right? Like that's gives me access to the most basic level of reality that I have access to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I take your point, and it's difficult, right? And this idea, and I watched Vervaeke, and might it be the case that there is not a uncrossable bridge between pluralism and the Christian story, right? The idea is that the logos, and this is something that I've been wrestling with the last few years, actually, is I used to think, how could somebody claim that one's particular religion is the true religion? If I happened to be born in India 50 years ago and had no access to Christianity, would I be damned to hell? Am I not? Do I not have the capacity to be saved if I'm a good person? So why would anybody claim one particular religion is right? And the way kind of that I've been thinking about it now is that they're all right. They're incomplete, right? And John is looking to articulate a religion that's not a religion, right? And it's, well, Christianity was a religion. That's not a religion. That's what it was called, right? It was the religion to end religions. It was a universalist claim uh, that didn't efface the previous religions. It just completed them. And I think the idea of the logos, like, like let's get straight to the brass tacks here. Did God become man in a body and then was killed and resurrected? I think that's what we have to look at, and that's what we have to wrestle with, right? Because I think you can make, arguments for, and I resonate obviously greatly with Peugeot's points that there's idea of, you can think of the Trinity, right, as in terms of gematria, which I don't subscribe to, but it's
Yeah,
very
what's
similar.
gematria, please?
Yeah, yeah. It's like when you can look at the numbers, you can apply kind of numbers, and they can elucidate different kind of instantiations of higher truths, right? So the Trinity is
Sure.
the number three, right?
Mhm.
And I studied Taoism for a long time, and I appreciate it very much. And I think it's the closest in terms of the logos being made manifest to Christianity, because in Christianity, the logos became man, right? It's like, hey, humans, you've been searching for truth. You've been done a great job, philosophical, scientific, religious systems throughout the history of mankind in different areas, and you've been coming up with similar solutions. All right, but here the logos became flesh. The truth is a person, right? It's like from a scientific sensibility. Now, the truth is when your assumptions, your hypothesis matches the outcome of the and conclusions of the experiment. That is what truth is. That the logos in Christianity does not invalidate that truth, right? Just like Heidegger talks about truth as aletheia in Greek. Aletheia is, lethe means hidden. Aletheia, which is how you say truth in Greek, is unconcealment, right? Is unhidden, is like a revealed truth, which doesn't invalidate the scientific truths as such, but incorporates them into a higher logic that the logos manifests in itself. Like the logos, through materialism was straitjacketed, and we have wonderful domains of inquiry that we call ologies, psychology, anthropology, biology, right? The logos in the ology in those disciplines and domains give us access to certain truths within certain constraints in the systemic composition of whatever domain you're looking at. But there are other qualities to the logos that are hard to articulate or hard to understand, especially now because we live. Like if you think of Christianity, kind of authentic Christianity being this kind of organic soil from which civilization can grow, we've paved over this soil the last few hundred years with a materialism, with like concrete materialism, that I don't know how anybody could be a Christian from that perspective. Like it doesn't make sense to me. And that's why I've looked at the church and Christianity as like, these people are going into these buildings and they're worshiping the truth, and they're coming out and living terrible lives and treating each other like crap and like shit, like, so why would I do that? It's like, but if you really wrestle with the ideas in Christianity and the life of Christ and what he was saying, and not to go on an aside, but Jordan Peterson, I used to think this was a cop out, and I've said this before. When they asked him, Jordan, do you believe in God? He says, I act as if God exists. And I was like, that's a cop out, man. No, I. So it's more important. Like if you act out the commandments, if we build a civilization acting out the commandments, the 10 commandments, and the two commandments that Christ had is love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, right? Those are the two main commandments. And then looking at the 10 commandments as a cultural code, as like a set of purified cultural code that if you do these things relationally with other human beings, right? So we have the logic of biology, the logic of physics, which does not go away, right? But you have the logic of human relationships. And here's 10 rules that if you follow, right, you will be able to build a civilization. You will be able to encode trust into human relations, right? And if imagine if we didn't lie to each other, genuinely didn't lie to each other. We didn't steal. We honored our parents and our ancestors, right? And the big one that Rene Girard really beautifully elucidates is the 10th commandment: don't covet thy neighbor's things. So, at one sense, from a materialist perspective or just a general perspective, why would God care if you're sleeping with your neighbor's wife. What kind of God cares if you sleep with your neighbor's wife or you're jealous of your neighbor's goods? What kind of God is would care about that? It's like, well, here are the rules, the base code. If you follow these, you can develop and build civilization, the bedrock of the kingdom of heaven, in a sense, right? And if you think about it, right, we all lie, we all get jealous of our neighbors' things, and then we've capitulated to systems that have amplified the worst parts of our human consciousness. And you see the Tristan Harris, who did the video, did the documentary, the
Social dilemma.
social dilemma, right? And he had a quote in there. Where he says, we're we're worried about AI taking over, kind of to amplify the best of us, but it's really amplified the worst of us. And the outcomes of the suicide rates for young 12-year-old girls and boys is up 200%. Like, these outcomes of these technologies that we're leveraging and using, are showing us something about the implicit, inherent kind of orientations that we are encoding into the algorithms, right? It's like, it's bringing out the worst of people. And where are you going to stand from? Where are you going to have your ground to make a decision on what's good or bad, right? If you have a scientific materialistic kind of bedrock, then you're kind of at a loss when it comes to making these kind of moral considerations. And then if you think that, Christianity is just like any other religion, right? Then you're never going to explore it. Like, you're never going to really wrestle with it. And like, I had the same experience. I found Eastern Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and Taoism especially just shined forth for me. And everybody's exploring being spiritual, you're not religious. And everybody's allowed to explore everything but Christianity. Anything, neo-paganism, like whatever it is, as you should, right? But it's keeping us from actually looking genuinely with an open heart at what Christ was, right? What if he was God that became man? What if he does give you a code that encodes trust, love, empathy, compassion at the base of civilization to build the kingdom of heaven? What if that's a possibility? Well, if you're not going to look at it with an open heart, or even the culture doesn't allow you to orient your gaze towards it, then you know we're nowhere, in a sense. And so it's just to go back here off the rant here. So we were talking about the Trinity, right? One is unity, two is multiplicity, three is unity in multiplicity. What is the quality? What is that which binds people? Religion, right? And this is my kind of critique of the game B folks, right? Who are awesome, wonderful systems thinker that come up with wonderful solutions. But it's like, what is going to bind the people together? That is a transcendent quality, right? That is what we see in idolatry and ideologies, right? This binding force is the structure of reality, right? And if you don't orient it mindfully, appropriately, the right way, which then it will necessarily bind itself to something that will destroy the civilization. It has a disintegrating effect. So I don't know that there's that big of a tension between, Vervaeke's pluralist perspective, which I appreciate as well, in terms of, Pajot's unity and multiplicity, right? Christ is that which appropriately unifies the multiplicity and multiplies the unity. There is a way, well, that can happen, that will create well-being in the world, right? And that's just outside of the idea that God became man, right?
Oh,
Sorry, there's a lot there, but
yeah. It's hard to unpack that, because my central I can hear the passion in what you're saying, right? And in the sense that that there's a feeling that there's a disintegrating force, and that the materialist worldview that we've inherited um, doesn't have the necessary goods to deal with it, right? Like, I sometimes think, like you asked me about the rise of woke, right? And there's this idea that you need to be an ally. Right? And what is an ally? An ally is somebody who actually literally takes their own agency completely out of the situation, and takes their own capacity for judgment out of the situation, because they assume that without the experience of oppression that whoever they're allied to has experienced, that they cannot have a valid understanding of it from the standpoint of epistemology. I think this is extraordinarily a destructive perspective. Right? And so when someone says that I should be an ally to LGBTQ, or I should be an ally to the Black community, or an ally to the trans community, I said, I know. Because being your ally actually won't even help you. You know, this is the Jordan Peterson idea that, you know, you don't want to give people unconditional. You want to give them, you want to love the part of them that wants the best for them. You love that part unconditionally. But also, you have to be willing to help them by being confrontational, by standing in the fire with them and saying, this part of you is not serving you, right? If I love you in a way that means that I go buy heroin for you when you're an addict, I don't love you, right? I'm just codependent. And so what we're being asked to be in being allies is to actually just be people's codependent tools. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear that, what I think to myself is, I don't want to be your ally, but I do want to be your brother. Right? And I literally think to myself, I could be your brother in Christ. Right? Like we can, there's something incredibly powerful about the symbolism of the idea of being washed in the blood of the man who died that death could be defeated. Mm-hmm. Right? Because he loved us despite all of our sins. And I can feel that, and I can hear that ringing within you. But I'm not satisfied with the assumptions about how we justify truth that seem to come out there, right? Because
what do you mean by truth?
So epistemology is the knowledge of how we establish truth, right? So when I say that it's true that that pi is 3.14, so, right? Like we can go measure that over and over and over again, and it will replicate every time. It has been replicated who knows how many times, right? We can go measure how fast something falls in a vacuum and know the exact force of gravity on this planet. Right? So with the experimental method, we have a capacity for verifying the truth value of a statement that has given us extraordinary power. Mm-hmm. That system of justification cannot be applied to the claim that Christ is God made manifest.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
I agree. Yeah.
Because we don't have the tools, right? We couldn't have the tools as far as I can tell, right? Like this is a story that happened 2,000 years ago, right? Did Christ die? Did Christ exist? Almost everyone agrees historically he existed. Well, did he die? Well, everyone who existed up till now has died, right? Did he rise from the dead? Well, that's an extraordinary claim.
Extraordinary right? In the context of how that claim of truth is what we can measure given the tools we have right now.
Yeah, given that every other person who's ever died that we know of doesn't come back from the dead. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. So now, if you adopt a rational materialist mindset and you apply the principle of parsimony, then you would conclude that is highly unlikely to have happened. Right? Mm-hmm. But if you're actually an open-minded scientific person, you also can't conclude that it didn't happen for sure. Right? Because there's no way to falsify it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right? So here's where I'm at with that, right? I can operate as a rational materialist. I can also operate as a pragmatist and say, perhaps accepting this and trusting that it happened can change my life in such a way and can give evidence for the value of that belief through putting it to practice, right? But, and this is a conversation that I had with Rafe Kelley and Interplay, we have this problem that once we allow in the truth claim that Christ died for our sins and rose from the dead, because it moves us and it changes us, right? Where does that stop, right? Do we, like, I think it's pretty darn clear that there are things in the Bible that are not literally true, right? Or not, that when we apply the scientific method to them, they appear to not be the case, right? The story of Exodus is probably not very representational of what actually happened. We don't have good evidence. We have very little evidence, or when we look for evidence that the Jews were slaves in Egypt, it's not there, right? So I feel like in talking to Paul and what I hear of John, like, they wouldn't necessarily want to dispute that claim, right? They don't want to claim the literal truth of every word in the Bible, right? Like most of the people now who are in the interesting part of this conversation, they're not trying to say that the world was was literally created in 7 days, right? And that evolution is false. It really comes down to this one central claim, which is, okay, so the story of what's happened in Genesis is symbolic, and it can exist. And this is like Jonathan Pageau, right? That story is true to him because it talks about how you act and orient in life, but he doesn't view that truth as, so far as I can tell, he doesn't view that truth as in competition with the truth that the Earth is 3 billion years old and that life evolved from single-celled organisms over, over billions of years, right? Those two truth claims to him seem to be non-competitive.
Mm-hmm.
But Christ's death and resurrection is a claim that that they view as true.
Mm-hmm.
In something that is beyond symbolic, right? Like, Jordan Peterson says there are places where the archetypal and the literal touch.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the resurrection of Christ is that place.
Mm-hmm.
But how would you establish that? Like, what's your epistemology that tells you, okay, here's the one place that they touch, and they didn't touch, say, it's funny, you talk about pluralism, right? I think it's my understanding of Taoism and my understanding of Buddhism, which are very incomplete, lends me to believe that you can be a Taoist and a Buddhist and a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Those things are not in competition with each other. But I don't think that you can be a Christian and a Muslim. Right?
Well, yeah.
The claims of the Quran about, and what's the book, the Hadith, about Christ and his role, and about Muhammad and his role, they're not congruent. You can't square that circle, I don't think. And again, I'm not a scholar of the Quran or a scholar of the Bible. That's just my impression. So you can apply all of the wisdom of Taoism. You can use the I Ching, and I don't think that prevents you from accepting Christ's story or even believing that it literally happened. And I think that you can live the Eightfold Path and accept the noble truths of Buddhism. And I mean, Buddha literally says he's just a guy, right? It's like, so it's pretty easy to slot him in next to it. But but Islam says there is no Trinity, and Muhammad is the final prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see how you can make those two things congruent. So there are some things that can play well, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are some that can't play well. And if you make a claim that the archetypal touches in the life of Christ, and how do you not make that same claim for Muhammad? And if those two things are completely incongruent, then what is the epistemology that allows you to navigate that?
Mm-hmm.
Why is the symbolism of Christianity true and the symbolism of Islam not true? if it's true that they cannot be both true.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? There you have to make there's a selection process in terms of what you consider true, and your question of what are the epistemologies, what are the epistemological structures you can stand on to make that consideration, right?
Yeah.
And that's where this term faith comes in, right? Which has there's so much baggage with all of these terms, it's hard to even discuss them, right? Faith is, why would you believe in something without evidence? That's what faith is. We don't need it anymore. We have a method to ascertain truth, so faith isn't necessary. Well, it's Marshall McLuhan was a very devout Catholic, and he said faith is a mode of perception, right? Faith is a state of being you can cultivate through, in from a Christian sense and a Buddhist sense, right? Is purifying the heart, right? The purifying the senses to be able to develop discernment to intuit higher truths. Now, that can lead to suicide bombers, right? It could lead. No, it's a very subtle like thing that needs to be discussed and looked at, because you have cults, like cults happen, right? And there's a lot of power in these religious processes that we're talking about here, as we're talking about in woke and whatnot. And I would say that it's not as a Christian, it's not mine to judge the true or falseness of Muslim religion, right? A lot of people disagree with me, right? It's like, so I've cultivated faith in this idea of Christ is the truth, and that has effects in my life and those around me, right? But I don't say that to my interest, and I don't think the distinction that needs to be made here is whether or not it's compatible with the Muslim faith. And if I can't make that distinction, then what makes me think mine is particularly true, right? Because that's going back to this understanding of the scientific method and the scientific epistemology and applying it to these areas that we're claiming now are sit on top of or are extra, right? Than the scientific thinking that we're accustomed to. And we see the fruits of that method, which have given us phenomenal tools and amazing technologies. But we've seen the fruits of those technologies and those tools, right? We see this in what's his name? He's got a book. He talks about how we had religion 1.0, which was organized religion, or meaning 1.0, which was the history of organized religion, and then meaning 2.0, which was the history of liberal democracy and inalienable rights, citizens, and both of those have failed. So we need to recapture the sacred, right? So all of these different, everybody's pointing to this space where we have to find something new, or we have to, recapture a way of orienting ourselves in the world that is healthier, right? And Sam Harris calls it, we need to distribute well-being equitably or something like that, right? So it's not that question from standing on that perch won't be satisfied at that level, right? And like that's why I'm not interested in even Christian apologetics, because I think it's more of it's a type of, it's not an intellectual exercise to argue your way, to argue yourself, to argue against someone so they become Christian. Again, that's polemics. That is, again, I think is the wrong way to look at it in a sense, right? Because there is a change of heart that happens. There's a qualitative shift that happens when you engage with the truth, right? And you can engage with it, right? And it's hard to do though, like prayer. Even Sam Harris prays, right? There's many different ways to pray and to worship. There's many different systems to explore in a sense, right? And I've spent my life exploring heavily with philosophy and psychology, psychoanalysis, and the Eastern religions, which I find beautiful, and Taoism specifically, right? And some 5 years ago, myself looking at me talking about Christianity and Christ in this way, I would find it incredulous, right? I also think now, 5 years from now, how do I know I'm not going to be onto another system, and I'm not looking at myself 5 years ago and be like, wow, became a Jesus freak, man. Just like out of nowhere, I started getting icons and whatnot, right?
Happened to a lot of people in the counterculture.
Right. So it's like, so I'm mindful, and we didn't get
No.
into the history of, we don't have time here, of like, so I had a spiritual awakening in 2015, which came from doing acupuncture, and I got heavily into Qigong. I was teaching energy work and these movements, meditation, mudras, mantras, and it's very powerful. This stuff is very powerful. Like, you can heal yourself through doing these different techniques, spiritual psychotechnologies, as Vervaeke calls them.
Yeah.
They're very powerful, and we have access to these spiritual tools, but the psychedelics especially. But if we don't have the cultivation, the discernment to understand how to use these tools, they will destroy us. Almost destroyed my marriage. Almost destroyed my family. Like, so it's it's a lot of caution in exploring these territories, because there's a lot of ways to be captured by, I'm Orthodox. I believe you can make Orthodoxy an ideology very easily and very quickly. And it could be something that is destructive for you and your family and your community. But it comes down to that, man, is the relationships that you have with yourself, the healing of trauma within yourself, within your family, within your community, and within, wherever it can bubble up from there. But that's all kind of my horizon that I've got, um, that I'm kind of observing right now. And, it's that particular set of questions in terms of the epistemology and comparing these different things. It's not going to be answered intellectually, I don't think, ever. And I think there's a
Well,
shift, though. There's
it doesn't need to be answered intellectually if the claims stop imposing themselves within right. If you say that in order to understand the truth of, of how the world works means that we have to accept the resurrection of Christ, and then that's sort of coming into competition with science, right? And if you
But
so
you're
so
using
so give me.
you're using the scientific, like, to say we have to accept the resurrection of Christ as science understands what that could possibly look like, from the understanding and the scientific tools and the scientific, understanding that we have now. We're applying that retrospectively, kind of counterfactually or
Yeah.
retrospectively, applying this evolved way of looking at the world. And if this in this doesn't make sense to this particular way that we look at the world right now, and you have to, consider, right, like Dominion, the work of Tom
Tom
Holland in
Holland.
his book Dominion, right? This, from a, it's hard not to go back to the scientific understanding of the efficacy of this story for it to propagate through history for so long and actually become the roots of how civilization was formed. Like, you have to use that, in your epistemological thinking, if you're going to be considering these things, right? But if we're applying the way that we think scientifically now, right, and we're applying that to the idea of the resurrection of the body of Christ, right, it's, that it's not going to, you might be able to kind of qualify it to, you kind of understand it, or you're okay with it to just go to church or whatnot, but that's not the point. Like, I don't know what I was trying to kind of say there, but
Let me jump in quickly because there's a couple of things that I think are useful here. I don't know if you saw the part of my conversation with Van Clay where he inverts Pascal's wager, but I think it's
mhm.
the best case for Christianity that I've heard. Right?
Yeah.
So he says essentially that his justification for faith is that if he devotes himself to Christ and the example that Christ gave, and um, the highest principles that Christ illustrates, that he will live the best life that he can live. And if at the end of that life, that story is simply symbolic, then he will still have lived his best life when he will have lost nothing. And if it's true that Christ died to defeat death and that he gets to be resurrected in the afterworld because he believed, then that's a good bonus, right? He doesn't lose anything. And so it's not about going to hell if you don't believe in Christ, right? It's about creating the kingdom of heaven better through living through his example, right? And that's a case that I'm intrigued by. And in my last conversation with Vervaeke and Van Clay, which is published today, we talked about the Hebrew term da'ath, right? And how it probably doesn't mean precisely what we now mean by faith. And that faith has become something propositional, something, the assertion of belief without evidence. But Vervaeke described it as a continuity of contact, right? It's like faith in Christ isn't saying that there's certainty in a scientific sense that he died and was resurrected. It's rather accepting it and trusting in it and allowing it to continue to transform you from within. And that if you can reposition faith in that way, come to understand faith in that way, that doesn't have to be in competition with our epistemology, because it's not really about you don't have, it's like use as an example, I cannot prove to you that my wife has never cheated on me, right? But by having faith in who she is and her behavior, that allows our relationship to grow and continue to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
It as something that I can assert with certainty and try to treat it in a scientific way, then it actually will cause it to fail in a sense. So this might be an interesting way to think about how we navigate the shoals of what scientific epistemology allows us and where it fails us, and what we might need to bring into our lives to fill those gaps and to allow the equitable distribution of well-being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. It reminds me of the idea, and we'll go just a few more minutes here if you got 5 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Like, can you prove that you love your kids? Can you prove scientifically that you love your children, right? Or that, can you
Maybe.
increase the love you have for your children by 17%? Like,
I mean, you might be able to track the neurohormones associated with love and increase them by 17%. Through a
great answer.
Series of actions. I wonder if you could do that with meta.
That's a great answer, because maybe this is the last kind of area we can explore here. I've kept you over already. So your body, your brains, your hormones secrete, different chemicals that respond to the love that you have for a child, right? Let's say serotonin, right? Oxytocin, which helps the bond between a mother and a child, and even a father and a child, right? But why is it necessary to reduce the love that you have for your child, right, to those chemicals? Why would it necessarily be the case, logically even, that the love, there's qualities, phenomenal qualities that, again, are subtler, that we can't understand, right? So why would you reduce that experience to the chemicals? Like, that you don't have to say that the chemicals are playing an important role. Another kind of way I think about it is, you're having a road trip with your best friends that you've reconvened after 20 years. You guys are taking a road trip to the woods. You get in the car, right? That car will not operate without the spark plugs firing, right? But you can't reduce this rich experience in the relationships deep within the friendships, right, to that spark plug, right? Because obviously the road trip can't have it unless the spark plug is working, right? Same idea as when you watch a movie, Braveheart, whatever movie it is, and I've talked about this before, and there's an event at the end of the movie, it just brings you and your family to tears, or brings you to tears, right? It's like the category mistake that I think is being made is, why was my heart wrenched and tears came out of my eyes from this, from the end of that movie? Let me break apart that screen and let me find its components, and let me break those components into their smallest parts, and that'll tell me why it was so meaningful to me. No, let me look at the relationships between the firing components of my television, and that'll tell me what was interesting. No, it's in the brain. Let's break apart the brain. Let's do fMRI imaging and find out what parts of the brain are firing and what neurochemicals are being excreted when that part of the movie, or when you have that spiritual experience, or when you're loving, you have love for your kids, you can find out where that physically manifests, right? But I don't see why that very rich and symbolic and just kind of spiritual experience would have to be reduced to the chemicals firing. Like, they're important, they're necessary to have a physical experience of that love, right? But it's that you can't reduce this higher structure, right, to this physical material process, right? Because you disregard the
Maybe.
whole, you disregard the rest of it, the actual quality of the feeling of the love that you have, the transformation and being a good father to that child, right? You just disregard all that in terms of the mechanical processes that we have the ability to measure and observe currently. It's like, they had the God helmet, like you can move someone's
sure.
particular part of their brain and it gives them a spiritual experience. So that's what religion is. It's just a brain function. I'm not convinced that at all. Like, it doesn't seem compelling, even though I appreciate the science and the ability to identify, neurochemical markers of certain emotional experiences. Wonderful. That doesn't efface that. I don't disregard that as a wonderful innovation in our scientific tools of measurement, right? But as a human being, there's a lot of places we could go in terms of, with data and statistical analysis. What's happening with COVID? We're not letting, my wife's an ICU nurse. We're not letting people be with their loved ones when they're dying, which is a healing event, right? And they're doing that because there's statistical analysis that if you let people, even without COVID, confirmed be with each other when they're dying, there's an X amount of probability that coronavirus will spread more. That's true. That statistical analysis may be true, right? But, we're reduced to data points, right? This is the idea of deincarnation. We're not considered human beings. And, when we let go of this idea of the dignity of the human person, which is rooted in Christianity, right? Things become really precarious really quickly. And it's, it seems like that's what's happening in a sense. A deincarnation is what we're observing and experiencing. So anyways.
Yeah, I mean, there's too much to unpack there because we got a conversation. There's something I love is not everything that can be measured matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. I think that's always going to be true. I think there is utility to measuring some of these things and understanding the mechanisms more deeply, but
they're not mutually exclusive.
No,
those two things.
But my work is about bringing people back into embodiment. So, yeah. So I'm very much about that, and I do think that we have the problem with the clockwork model of the universe is that we perceive ourselves more and more as just clockwork as well, and that is profoundly disembodying and works against a lot of the things that do make us thrive. So, yeah. There's a lot that could be unpacked there, but we'll have to do it another time.
Yeah, man. I'm sorry we didn't get to. I wanted to get into that, so I think we're gonna have to do a part 2. I'd love to do it sometime in the future after your talk, obviously, with Raveki and with Vanderklay would be great. Yeah. I'm excited to check that out. So, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and your attention and your thoughtful, genuine engagement with me, man. I appreciate it, Rafe. All right.
Awesome. Thanks, James.
All right, man.
Have a good day.
Talk to you soon. Bye. Yep.